September 8th, 1935, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Night had settled over the state capitol, but the building was still awake. Lights glowed in long marble corridors. Footsteps carried in hollow echoes. Voices drifted in low, tense conversations. Politics in Louisiana never truly slept. At the center of it all moved one man, Huey P. Long. He walked quickly, as he always did, surrounded by allies, bodyguards, and the charged atmosphere that seemed to follow him like summer thunderclouds. To some, he was a savior of the poor, a man who built roads where there had been dust, and gave books to children who had never owned one. To others, he was something far more dangerous, a ruler in everything but name, a man who bent courts, crushed opponents, and ruled Louisiana with a grip so tight it left fingerprints on the state itself. Then came the sound, a single gunshot, sharp, sudden, impossible to mistake. Chaos erupted in the corridor, shouting, running, the crack of more gunfire as bodyguards reacted in blind fury. Smoke hung in the air, bitter and metallic, drifting beneath the Capitol lights like a storm cloud trapped indoors. Huey Long lay on the marble floor, bleeding, conscious but fading, the noise around him dissolving into distant echoes. Within 48 hours, he would be dead, and with him died a question that had begun to trouble the entire nation. Not whether Huey Long ruled Louisiana, but whether he might one day rule America. Because before the bullet, before the legend, before the arguments that still ignite a century later, there was only a barefoot boy from the pine hills of northern Louisiana. A boy who had learned very early that the world was not fair, and who decided, long before anyone noticed, that he intended to change it, or break it trying. Long before the crowds, before the speeches, before the white suits and the roar of every man a king, there was only a boy in the piney woods of northern Louisiana. Huey P. Long was born in 1893 in Wynne Parish, a place that felt less like part of the modern United States and more like a forgotten corner of it. Roads were dirt, money was scarce. Opportunity arrived slowly, if it arrived at all. Wynne Parish carried a stubborn streak. It had been anti-secession during the Civil War, distrustful of elites, suspicious of anyone who claimed authority without earning it. That atmosphere seeped into young Huey the way humidity seeps into wood, invisible but permanent. His family was not destitute, but they were far from comfortable. Huey saw neighbors lose farms, watched merchants extend credit with one hand and tighten the rope with the other, and listened to adults speak in low voices about banks, railroads, and oil companies that seemed to operate by rules no one else could challenge. To a boy with a quick mind and a sharp memory, the pattern was unmistakable. The game was rigged. Huey was restless in school, brilliant but impatient. He preferred arguments to arithmetic, persuasion to procedure. Teachers found him difficult. Classmates found him magnetic. He could talk his way into trouble and out of it in the same afternoon. By his teenage years, he was traveling, selling goods door to door across Louisiana and neighboring states. It was an education no classroom could provide. He saw firsthand how wealth clustered in cities while rural communities struggled to keep the lights on. He met farmers who worked from sunrise to exhaustion and still fell deeper into debt each year. The distance between the powerful and the powerless was not theoretical to Huey Long. It had faces, names, calloused hands, and somewhere along those dusty roads, an idea began to harden inside him. If the system was built to serve the few, then someone would have to force it to serve the many. That belief did not make him gentle. It did not make him patient. It made him ambitious, and ambition, once lit, burns with its own oxygen. Huey studied law, not through the traditional academic path, but by reading relentlessly, absorbing statutes and cases the way a gambler studies cards. By his early 20s, he was practicing law in Louisiana, and already his reputation was forming. He did not represent banks. He did not defend corporations. He took cases for small farmers, laborers, and ordinary people who felt they had been cornered by forces too large to fight alone. In court, Huey Long discovered something that would define the rest of his life. Facts mattered. Law mattered. But emotion moved people. And Huey Long understood people. He spoke in plain language. He told stories instead of reciting arguments. He painted villains and heroes so clearly that juries could almost see them standing in the courtroom. Win or lose, people remembered him. And in politics, being remembered is the first step toward being feared or followed. By the time Huey Long set his sights on public office, he was no longer just a lawyer from Wynn Parish. He was becoming something else. A man who believed the wealthy had taken too much. A man who believed the poor had been silent too long. And a man who was beginning to realize that power was not something given, it was something taken. By the early 20th century, Louisiana was no longer just forests, farms, and river towns. Something darker and more powerful had pushed up through the earth: oil. And where oil flowed, power followed. The largest shadow over that power belonged to one name: Standard Oil. Even after its formal breakup, its influence lingered through subsidiaries, allies, and a network of companies that still shaped prices, transportation, and political decisions across the South. To many politicians, this was simply the way the world worked. To Huey Long, it looked like a kingdom without a crown. By 1918, Long had been elected to the Louisiana Railroad Commission, a body that regulated utilities and transportation. It sounded technical, even dull, but in reality, it was a pressure point. Railroads and oil companies depended on rates, routes, and permissions decided in quiet offices far from public view. Huey Long had no intention of keeping things quiet. He accused oil companies of cheating the state, underpaying taxes, and manipulating transportation costs to crush smaller competitors. He attacked them in hearings, in speeches, and in newspapers, naming companies and executives in language that was blunt, theatrical, and impossible to ignore. Where other officials spoke in careful phrases, Long spoke like a man in a courtroom, building a case before a jury of the public. And the public listened. Farmers who had never cared about regulatory commissions began repeating his words. Laborers talked about him in barber shops and on porches at dusk. For many ordinary Louisianans, Huey Long became the first politician who seemed less interested in pleasing the powerful than in confronting them. But every attack created enemies. Oil companies had lawyers. They had lobbyists. They had influence that moved quietly through legislative halls and editorial offices. Long began to discover that power rarely fights in the open. It works behind doors, in private conversations, in favors exchanged, and debts quietly called in. The resistance to him grew stronger. So did his determination. Huey Long was learning something essential, something that would shape the rest of his career. If you fight powerful interests, you cannot fight halfway. Half measures invite defeat, and defeat was something Huey Long refused to accept. By the early 1920s, his name was no longer known only in Wynn Parish, or even across northern Louisiana. He was becoming a statewide figure, a man who seemed to thrive on conflict, who gained strength from opposition rather than shrinking from it. Every speech sharpened his message. Every battle made him more visible. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing the moment it happened, Huey Long stopped being just a regulator. He became a contender. Because once you have challenged the most powerful forces in your state, running for governor no longer feels impossible. It feels inevitable. In 1928, Louisiana did something it had never done before. It handed the governor's office to a man who openly declared war on the establishment, and meant every word of it. Huey P. Long did not campaign like a traditional politician. He did not promise modest reforms or cautious improvements. He promised transformation. Roads where there were none, schools where children studied in crumbling buildings, hospitals for people who had never seen a doctor unless death was already standing in the doorway. And most of all, he promised to make the powerful pay for it. To the poor, it sounded like justice. To the wealthy, it sounded like a threat. When Long took office, Louisiana was still, in many ways, a 19th century state. Vast rural regions were isolated by mud roads that turned to rivers in heavy rain. Illiteracy rates were high. Public services were thin, scattered, and often neglected. Long attacked the problem with relentless energy. Highways began to stretch across the state, ribbons of concrete cutting through swamps and pine forests. Bridges rose over waterways that had once divided communities for generations. Schools expanded. Free textbooks were provided to students, a reform so simple and so effective that families felt the change almost immediately. To his supporters, it felt as if Louisiana were waking up. But progress came with a cost, and not just in dollars. Huey Long did not merely govern, he dominated. Legislators who opposed him found projects in their districts delayed or canceled. Political allies were rewarded, enemies were isolated. Power in Louisiana began to gather, slowly but unmistakably, around a single center of gravity. The press began to give him a nickname, one he embraced with theatrical delight, the Kingfish. It was half joke, half warning. Long cultivated an image larger than life. He spoke for hours, pacing stages, telling stories, making audiences laugh one moment and burn with anger the next. He understood something many politicians never grasped. People do not follow policy papers. They follow emotion. They follow conviction. They follow the feeling that someone is finally speaking for them. And Huey Long made millions feel exactly that. Yet beneath the momentum, beneath the cheering crowds and ribbon cuttings, tension was building. Critics accused him of bullying the legislature, of undermining democratic norms, of building a political machine that rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. They warned that Louisiana was drifting toward one-man rule, that efficiency was replacing accountability, that reform was becoming control. Supporters dismissed those warnings as the complaints of a comfortable elite who had lost their grip on power. Both sides believed they were defending democracy, and in the middle stood Huey Long, growing more powerful by the month, convinced that history favored the bold and that hesitation was the luxury of men who had never known hunger. By the end of his first years as governor, one thing was clear. Huey Long was no longer just a political figure. He was a force. And forces, once unleashed, rarely move in straight lines. They gather speed, they gather pressure, and eventually they collide. Power rarely grows without provoking fear. By 1929, only a year into his governorship, Huey P. Long had accumulated enough enemies to fill the State House. Wealthy businessmen resented his taxes. Political rivals resented his dominance. Even some former allies had begun to worry that the governor's methods were becoming too aggressive, too personal, too absolute. The charge that ignited the crisis seemed, at first, almost technical. Long was accused of misusing state funds and pressuring officials to support his policies. To his opponents, it was proof that the governor believed himself above the law. To his supporters, it was nothing more than an excuse, a weapon dressed up as principle. The Louisiana House of Representatives voted to impeach him. The state was suddenly split, not quietly, not politely, but loudly and visibly, like a crack running through glass. Newspapers thundered, crowds gathered, rumors spread faster than facts. In cafes and barbershops, in courthouse squares and river docks, people argued about one question. Was Huey Long saving Louisiana or seizing it? The trial moved to the Senate, where removal from office would require a 2/3 vote. Long did not retreat into silence while the process unfolded. He fought back the only way he knew how, with speeches, pressure, and political calculation sharp enough to cut steel. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted, promises were made, lines were drawn and redrawn, and then came what became known as the round robin. A group of senators signed a public pledge declaring that no matter what evidence was presented, they would vote to acquit. It was not subtle, it was not elegant, but it was effective. The impeachment collapsed. To Long's enemies, it felt like proof that the system had been bent beyond recognition. To his supporters, it was a victory against a political establishment that had tried to overturn the will of the voters. But something fundamental had changed. Before the impeachment, Huey Long had been a powerful governor. After it, he was something else entirely. The struggle had hardened him. Compromise, never his strongest instinct, now seemed to him not merely unnecessary, but dangerous. Opposition was no longer disagreement. It was obstruction. and obstruction, in Long's mind, was something to be crushed. In the years that followed, he tightened his control over Louisiana's political machinery. Loyalists filled key positions. Funding flowed toward allies. The gears of government began to move with a new efficiency, but also with a new rigidity, as if every lever were connected to a single hand. Supporters saw progress. Critics saw the shadow of authoritarianism. Both saw the same man, and Huey Long himself seemed to sense that Louisiana was becoming too small to contain his ambitions. The battles he wanted to fight were no longer just state battles. The enemies he spoke of were no longer just local elites. They were national. Because beyond Louisiana, the Great Depression was tightening its grip on America, and millions were beginning to listen for anyone who sounded certain, anyone who sounded bold, anyone who promised not patience, but change. Huey Long was preparing to step onto a larger stage, and when he did, he would carry a message that would shake the country itself. By 1934, the Great Depression had hollowed out the American middle class like termites in a timber beam. Banks had failed, farms had folded, breadlines stretched like quiet parades of endurance. In Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt was rolling out the New Deal, a vast experiment in federal recovery. Relief programs expanded, regulations tightened, the federal government grew larger, more muscular, more present in everyday life than ever before. For many Americans, it felt bold. For Huey P. Long, it did not feel bold enough. Long had won election to the United States Senate in 1930, though he continued to control Louisiana's political machinery with a steady grip. Now, he had a national platform, and he used it the way he used everything else, loudly. He began proposing something far more radical than Roosevelt's reforms: a cap on personal fortunes, a limit on inherited wealth, a guarantee that every American family would receive a minimum income, a home, and access to education. He called it "Share Our Wealth." It was not a policy paper. It was a slogan that moved like lightning. Within months, thousands of clubs sprang up across the country, then tens of thousands. Millions of members signed on, organizing meetings, distributing pamphlets, waiting for direction from the kingfish. Long's speeches grew more theatrical, more national in tone. He sang "Every Man a King" at rallies, transforming policy into anthem. He spoke of billionaires as dragons hoarding treasure while children starved. He promised to level the scales not gently, but decisively. To struggling Americans, it sounded like justice sharpened into action. To business leaders and conservative politicians, it sounded like confiscation wrapped in applause. Even Roosevelt took notice. The president publicly dismissed Long, but privately, he understood the threat. Polls suggested that if Huey Long ran for president in 1936, he could siphon off enough votes to fracture the Democratic coalition, perhaps even tilt the election. The question was no longer whether Long had influence. It was whether he had ambition without limit. Critics warned that his proposals were economically reckless, mathematically unstable, fueled more by resentment than practicality. They pointed to the way he governed Louisiana, to the concentration of power, to the intimidation of rivals. They asked whether a man who centralized control in one state might attempt to do the same with a nation. Supporters countered with a simpler argument: what good is caution when millions are hungry? Across America, radio sets carried his voice into living rooms. His accent was thick, his cadence relentless, his confidence absolute. He did not sound like a cautious reformer. He sounded like a man certain that history was waiting for him. And perhaps it was. By 1935, Huey Long was no longer merely a senator from Louisiana. He was a movement, a possibility, a variable in the fragile equation of American democracy. The kingfish had swum far beyond his home waters, and the currents ahead were deep. September 8th, 1935. The marble corridors of the Louisiana state capitol glowed under electric light, polished and proud, a monument to the very power Huey P. Long had built. He had helped design the building himself, tall, commanding, impossible to ignore. That night, it became something else: a hallway, a confrontation, a gunshot. The man accused of pulling the trigger was Dr. Carl Weiss, the son-in-law of a political opponent Long had targeted. Accounts differ. Some say Weiss fired first. Others argue he merely struck Long and was then shot dozens of times by bodyguards in a storm of retaliatory gunfire. What is certain is this: Huey Long was hit. At first, he remained conscious. He spoke. He was carried to a hospital. Surgeons operated. Louisiana held its breath. 2 days later, he was dead. He was 42 years old. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Tens of thousands attended his funeral. Crowds lined the streets. Farmers who had never shaken his hand wept openly. For them, he had been more than a politician. He had been proof that someone loud and fearless could fight for people who felt forgotten. But in Washington, relief moved quietly through certain corridors of power. President Franklin D. Roosevelt no longer faced a populist rival capable of splitting the Democratic base. The Share Our Wealth movement began to fade without its central voice. Louisiana's political machine endured, but the man who powered it was gone. And with his death, a question entered American history that can never be answered. What would have happened in 1936? Would Huey Long have run for president? Would he have fractured Roosevelt's coalition? Would he have forced the New Deal further left? Or would the nation have rejected him as too extreme, too controlling, too dangerous? Legends grow best in unfinished stories. Huey Long did not lose an election. He did not fade into retirement. He did not slowly diminish under scrutiny. He was stopped at the height of his power, at the edge of possibility. That kind of ending does something strange to memory. To supporters, he remains a champion of the poor, a man who built roads, expanded schools, and dared to challenge concentrated wealth when others hesitated. To critics, he remains a warning, a reminder that charisma and reform can travel alongside coercion, that democracy can erode not only through neglect, but through efficiency. He lies buried on the Capitol grounds he once dominated, the tall tower casting its long shadow across his grave each afternoon. Stone, silence, monument. But the debate never rests, because Huey Long forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When people are desperate, they do not ask for moderation. They ask for power. And sometimes, they are willing to give one man more of it than a republic was ever meant to hold. History prefers its villains obvious and its heroes uncomplicated. Huey P. Long refuses both roles. Huey P. Long built roads that still carry traffic today. He expanded education for children who had never owned a textbook. He forced powerful corporations to negotiate with a state that had long bowed its head. Those are not illusions, they are measurable facts. But so is this. He centralized power. He punished opposition. He treated democratic friction not as a feature of the system, but as a flaw to be corrected. And that tension is where his story becomes more than biography. It becomes a mirror. The 1930s were not merely an era of economic collapse. They were a stress test for democracy itself. When institutions falter, when inequality yawns wide, when citizens feel unseen and unheard, they do not drift toward quiet administrators. They gravitate toward force. Huey Long understood something elemental about politics. People do not rally around spreadsheets. They rally around certainty, around conviction, around someone who speaks as though the future can be seized, not negotiated. That is intoxicating. It was intoxicating in Louisiana. It was intoxicating during the Great Depression, and it remains intoxicating whenever frustration outpaces patience. The question Huey Long leaves behind is not whether he was right or wrong in every policy proposal. The deeper question is this: how much power are we willing to concentrate in one pair of hands if the promise feels urgent enough? Because reform and control can wear similar uniforms. Justice and dominance can share the same language. A republic survives on friction, on disagreement, on the slow grind of compromise. It is inefficient by design. It frustrates, it delays, it forces patience. A strong man promises speed. Huey Long promised speed, and millions listened. He died before America had to decide whether to embrace or reject him on a national stage. That unfinished arc allows both sides to claim him. Champion of the poor, architect of an emerging autocracy, visionary cut short, warning shot across history. Perhaps he was all of it. The kingfish rose from the pine hills of Wynn Parish and nearly swam into the center of American power. A bullet ended the ascent, but it did not end the debate. And maybe that is the lasting lesson of Huey Long. Democracy does not only face threats from indifference, it also faces temptation from strength. And sometimes, the loudest voice in the room is not asking whether power should be limited. It is asking whether power, finally, should win.